Okay, next up we're going to be talking about the CSS unset, revert, and initial property values. So we have a whole bunch of CSS properties here that are attached to this page. I'm looking at the HTML and the body element. I have the HTML element selected, so that's what's highlighted here. And this is saying in the main.css file, these are all the properties that I have set, and these are all the values. Now, unset, revert, and initial are all values that I could use for these properties. Something else I want to point out here first before we dive into it too deeply, I want to make sure that you understand how CSS builds up the cascade of styles and how it actually puts together and decides what values are going to be assigned to which properties on which elements. So, initial has to do with the initial value for every single property. CSS as a standard, without HTML attached, without looking at web pages, just CSS, every single property has an initial value. It doesn't care, okay, is this thing on a div or an image or a paragraph or the HTML element? It's just every property. Say, for example, padding. Padding has an initial value. Then, after that initial value, the user agent style sheet, that gets applied. So we have these properties right here are coming from my CSS file. But there's also the user agent style sheet. And every single browser has its own user agent style sheet. And this is where it attaches HTML elements to specific properties. So in the Chrome user agent style sheet, the HTML element, the value for display is set to block. The initial value for the display property is actually inline. But that inline gets changed or overwritten to be display block. And that's just part of Chrome. Now, most of the browsers have the same values in their user agent style sheet for most properties, but not all. So this property is part of the Chrome style sheet, the user agent style sheet. Display had an initial value of inline, that's overwritten by block, and then inside of here, if I did another value for display, I would be overriding the user agent style sheet. So initial talks about the initial one. Unset and revert, these values are, hey, I want to set it back to, and with unset, we're talking about the initial value. With revert, we're talking about putting it back to the value from the user agent style sheet. The only exception to that is for unset and revert, if they are inheriting a value, the inherited value will be used first, and it won't go all the way back to the initial or the user agent style sheet. All right, so let's do a few little experiments and see how this is going to work. So I have my page here. I've got some default values, background color, and so on. My main element right here in the middle, if I scroll down to that and I click on main, we can see that the display is set to flex. So user agent style sheet display block has the line through it. So this is being overridden by this. And the user agent is overriding that initial value of inline. So if I were to come in here and say, I want to revert, display revert, I'm actually going to be setting it back to block. This thing right here, the user agent style sheet. So that value is what's being put inside of here instead of revert. If I say unset, I'm now saying go back to the initial value for the display property. Forget about what element it's in, just what is the initial value for display. And right now, this is displaying my main element as display inline. All right, so I'll put this back to flex the way it was. Now, let's do a few others. So in my media queries here, in my CSS, here's all the defaults that I've got. I've set the color as brown for these elements right here. Main, we've talked about the display property. In my media query, if the page is bigger than 1,000 pixels wide, what do I want to change? Well, we can take the background color for HTML And if we come up here, we can see, okay, the background color that we were setting inside of HTML and body is this. If we go and we put this to initial or unset or revert, all three of them are going to be the same. So I do that, come back in here. Here's what I'm getting for my default. If we look at the HTML element, there it is, there's the color. But as soon as I stretch this bigger than 1000 pixels, there we go. I have changed now. This background color is no longer being applied. It's now the initial. This media query is saying, okay, whatever the initial value is, which because background color has the same value for the user agent style sheet and for the initial property, if I put unset in here, it's the same thing. If I put revert in here, it's going to be the same thing. All right, so initial. With main display flex, we can override that. So instead of using flex, we can say, hey, I wanted to do the user agent. So to do user agent, we revert. That is display block. So these are now display block, everything inside of main. So they're being stacked vertically like that. For the color of the text, we have inside header main, DL and footer, color is brown. Now inside of main, we have our paragraphs. We take a look at it here. So there's main. We have these two paragraphs rather, that are inside of there. They're using that brown color for the background. And what I want to do is inside the media query for the paragraph, we're going to change the color. If I say revert, okay, revert means go back to the user agent style sheet, except here we are, we're over the 1000. It's still brown. We've still got the brown color. The background changed. This is the brown, and that is because we do have an inherited value. If we look down inside of here, we've got display revert for the main. On the paragraph, we've got the color set to revert. But it's not jumping back to the user agent color, which is the black. It is going to say, hey, I'm actually inheriting something. So we can look down here to see, okay, there's paragraph. We're inheriting this user agent style sheet and inherited from main. So color brown. It's got the line through it because we did actually give a new value for color right up here. That's why the line is through it. But the revert says if there's something that we can inherit, that we are inheriting, use that instead of using the initial value or the user agent style. If this wasn't on here, then we're back to black. But because we are inheriting that value, we still get that value. All right, and our last one here with my images, we'll do an example with just unset, which is the other property right here. So unset, I've set a minimum width and a width on the image inside of the paragraph, and I did that so that as we expanded here, you can see that the image gets a little bit bigger, all the way, and then it's still doing that. When I get beyond that point, it's still getting larger and larger. I don't want it to do this. In my layout, what I want to do is when I reach a certain maximum size, I want to stop it at that point. I don't want it to still continue being 100% width. I just want it to automatically be whatever size it was originally. My image, you can see down here at the bottom, is 500 pixels wide. That's the size that I want it to be on the page once I get beyond this 1000 pixels. So we can say in here that min width, and I'm going to use unset, and width, unset. So I'm saying get rid of these values. If there's a value that's inherited, we can use them. But for min, width, and width, we're never going to have a value that's inherited. So we are jumping back to initial value here. And there we are. There's the 500 pixels. So as I shrink this down, I've got my min size. There it is. I'm adjusting the width, and now it's starting to grow, but once I get to the 1000, it's just going to be the 500 pixels. So you can see the paragraph is getting wider, but my image is staying the same. And what I'll do is I will comment out these ones just to keep my layout the same. There we go. So I've still got the flex layout with the 2 columns. The 1 column is growing with the image, but then once I get to the 500 pixels, it stays that size. And the remaining space is given to the other column. All right, so that is unset and revert, meaning go back to the initial value, go back to the user agent style, unless there's something that is being inherited, a value that is being inherited for that property, or initial, which is the initial property given, the initial value given to that property as part of CSS, what is defined in CSS. User agent style sheet, that's the connection. Taking the initial value and saying, okay, we can use that, but if we want it to be different for this specific element, and the good example for that was the main. Inside of main, let me shrink this down a little bit. There we go. So main is display flex in my CSS. Display block is the user agent style sheet. The initial value of display is inline. So initial, and then the user agent gets applied, and then our CSS style sheets get applied. All right, hope that all makes sense. I've left the notes down here at the bottom explaining those 3 things again. If you want a copy of this file, if you look in the description, you will find a link to the code gist with all of this code. And as always, thanks for watching.